Imagine being told, at 19 years old, that once your labor began, you were not permitted to leave a single room for 2 full weeks, not to walk outside, not to open a window, even in July, not to see daylight properly in some households until the 14th day had passed. This was called lying in, and for a Victorian woman it wasn't a suggestion. It was law of a kind, unwritten but absolute. And there's something else. In many respectable homes, a woman in labor was surrounded by other women, and almost never a doctor. If a physician was called at all, custom in the early parts of the century often kept him working blind, his hands guided under a sheet, so he would not actually see the body he was examining. Some man midwives, as they were called, delivered hundreds of babies this way, feeling their way by touch alone, beneath thick layers of cloth, so that modesty could be preserved even in the middle of the most dangerous hour of a woman's life. Hi friends, tonight we're going somewhere quiet and a little heavy, but I promise, gently held. We're stepping into the hidden world of pregnancy and childbirth in Victorian England, the parts that rarely make it into the costume dramas. If you'd like, dim the lights now, pull a blanket up around your shoulders, and let your body settle. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Picture a bedroom in London, 1863. Heavy curtains, always drawn. A fire that never quite goes out, even in warm weather, because a lying-in room was meant to be kept close and warm, almost stifling by our standards. The air smells of tallow candles, and something herbal, perhaps chamomile, or a sprig of pennyroyal tucked in a drawer, more superstition than medicine. Outside you can hear the ordinary sounds of the street, a cartwheel catching on a cobblestone, someone calling out to a neighbor, but in here time moves differently, softer, slower, sealed off. You are 22. This is your first child. You have been told what to expect by your mother, your aunt, the women of your street, but not by any doctor, and certainly not by any book written for someone like you. Medical texts existed, yes, but they were considered improper reading for a lady. Understanding your own body too well was, strangely, seen as a kind of indecency. There is no pain relief waiting for you. Chloroform exists somewhere in the world by this point. A Scottish physician named James Young Simpson had begun experimenting with it in the 1840s, but its use in childbirth is controversial, whispered about as risky, even sinful, by some clergymen who felt pain in labor was ordained, an inheritance from Eve herself. Queen Victoria herself, famously, would eventually use it for 2 of her later children, and that single fact would do more to change public opinion than any doctor's argument. But for most women, in most years of this century, none of that comfort reaches you. You labor as women have labored for centuries, through it, not around it. The room is full, and yet oddly private in its own way. Your mother is there, a neighbor known for her steady hands. Perhaps a woman who does this professionally, a midwife, unlicensed, untrained by any official body, but trusted because she has caught more babies in this parish than anyone can count. There is a particular kind of quiet competence in her hands, born entirely of repetition, of having done this so many times that her fingers know things her mind couldn't put into words. If something goes wrong, and by the numbers of this era, something going wrong is not a distant possibility, but a real and present one, a doctor might be sent for. But even then, there's a strange formality to it. In earlier decades of the century, and still lingering in more traditional homes even later on, a male physician attending a birth would often work beneath a sheet draped over your knees, examining you by feel alone, his eyes fixed politely on the wall or the middle distance. Modesty, it seems, mattered more than sight. Even in the single moment a body needs to be seen and understood the most. Let's sit with the numbers for a moment, gently, the way you might sit with a fact that's hard but needs to be known. In the mid-Victorian period, maternal mortality hovered somewhere around 4 to 5 deaths per 1,000 live births. And that's the recorded rate, likely an undercount, since many deaths in poorer households went quietly unlisted. That means, in a busy parish with a few hundred births a year, several mothers simply would not survive the year. Puerperal fever, what we would now call a bacterial infection, often introduced by unwashed hands or unsterilized instruments, was the quiet killer stalking every lying-in room. No one understood germs yet, not truly, not until the later work of men like Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur began to filter into practice. A doctor could deliver one baby, wash his hands in nothing but water, and move directly to the next patient, carrying an invisible danger from one bedside to another. There's a strange, sad irony worth pausing on, and it says something about how history often moves sideways rather than forward. Hospital births, for wealthier or more modern families, were sometimes more dangerous than home births attended by an ordinary local midwife, because hospitals concentrated more doctors, more hands, more cross-contamination between patients in an age before anyone understood why washing mattered. A humble midwife who delivered only within one small neighborhood, touching mostly healthy bodies, sometimes kept her patients safer than the grand teaching hospitals of London, simply by accident of isolation. You labor through the night. Your mother wipes your forehead with a cloth dipped in water from a chipped basin. Someone has sent a boy running for the midwife 2 streets over, his boots echoing on the cobblestones outside, small and urgent in the dark. There is a fire crackling low in the grate, insisted upon even though it's summer, because cold was thought to be dangerous to a laboring woman and her child. Heat, by contrast, was seen as protective, almost sacred. You will sweat through the sheets more than once before morning, and when it's over, if it goes well, and truly most of the time it did go well, though the exceptions cast a long shadow over every household, you are not simply handed your child and told to rest a day or two. You are confined. Lying in could stretch anywhere from 9 days to a full month, depending on your class and your family's means. The wealthier you were, the longer you were expected to recover in bed, attended by servants, visited by friends who would sit at your bedside and admire the infant. The poorer you were, the sooner you were expected back on your feet, sometimes within days, because there was washing to be done, and mouths to feed, and no one else to do either. There's a small, dry irony in that too, if you let yourself notice it. The women with the least support recovered the fastest, not because their bodies were stronger, but because poverty simply didn't allow for the luxury of rest. Rest, in this era, was almost a class privilege in itself. Something you could afford, like lace, or clean linen, or a fire kept burning through the night. Churching was the final ritual that marked your full return to ordinary life. About a month after birth, a new mother would attend a special church service, a formal blessing, a kind of ceremonial welcome back into public society, into the sight of God and neighbors alike. Until that service, in the eyes of many communities, you weren't quite fully returned to the world yet. You existed in a strange soft in-between, a mother, but not yet a public one. It's a small detail, easy to miss in the history books, but it tells you something about how deeply this culture wrapped birth, in ceremony, in privacy, in a hush that separated it from ordinary daily life. You'll notice, if you think about it for a moment, how much silence surrounded all of this. Girls were rarely told what labor would actually feel like before it happened to them. Mothers often protected their daughters from the details out of a strange mixture of modesty and mercy, not wanting to frighten them, and not quite believing it was proper conversation either. So many young Victorian women arrived at their own first labor with almost no real preparation at all, learning everything in a single overwhelming night, guided only by the quiet, practiced hands of the women gathered around the bed, still frightened, still trusting, still she and her mother's hands in the low firelight. That was simply how it was. But there was one part of this hidden world that even the women in the room rarely spoke of out loud. Not the birth itself, but what happened in the months leading up to it, when a woman's body first began to change, and the strange, quiet ways Victorian society expected her to hide it, even from her own reflection. Here's a strange fact worth sitting with. A Victorian woman could be visibly, unmistakably pregnant, 7, 8 months along, and still be expected to pretend, in polite company, that nothing at all was happening beneath her clothes. Not deny it outright. Just never acknowledge it, never say the word pregnant out loud, if she could help it. The polite phrase was, "in a delicate condition," or simply, "expecting," murmured quietly, almost apologetically, as though the whole business were something slightly embarrassing that had happened to her, rather than a fact of her own body. Hi again, if you drifted for a moment there. That's all right. That's exactly what this is for. Let yourself sink back into the pillow. We're still in that same soft candlelit world, just moving backward in time now, to the months before the birth we just left behind. Picture a woman perhaps 5 months along, standing in front of a looking-glass in her bedroom. It's autumn, 1861. The light through the window is pale and gray, the kind of light that makes everything in a room look a little softer, a little more forgiving. She is doing something that seems, to us now, faintly absurd. She is loosening the laces of her corset, not tightening them, and studying the effect in the mirror with real concern. Because for a woman of the middle or upper classes, the goal wasn't to accommodate her changing body. The goal was to disguise it for as long as humanly possible. There's a particular garment worth knowing about here, and it tells you almost everything about the era's relationship to pregnancy. It was sometimes called an accouchement corset, or simply a maternity stay, and rather than removing structure from a pregnant woman's silhouette, it was designed with expandable side lacing, sometimes with small gussets or panels that could let out gradually, week by week, so that a woman could keep wearing a corset, keep maintaining that expected, disciplined shape, right up until fairly late in pregnancy. Some doctors of the time actually recommended continued, gentle corseting, believing it offered support to a woman's back and abdomen. Other doctors, a growing minority as the century wore on, argued the opposite, that tight lacing during pregnancy was dangerous, restricting circulation, cramping the growing child. The two camps argued in medical journals for decades, and meanwhile, ordinary women were left to guess, mostly relying on what their mothers and aunts had done before them. You can hear, if you let yourself imagine it, the soft creak of whalebone stays as she adjusts them, the quiet rustle of petticoats settling back into place. Somewhere below, a maid is laying a fire in the front parlor, because visitors are expected this afternoon, and this woman, let's call her Mrs. Ashworth, though of course she isn't anyone in particular, just a shape borrowed from 100 women like her. Mrs. Ashworth is trying to decide how many more weeks she can manage before she simply stops receiving callers altogether, because that was the other half of this quiet performance. Eventually, however clever the corsetry, a woman's condition would become impossible to fully conceal, and at that point, the solution wasn't to acknowledge it, the solution was to disappear. Upper and middle-class women in the later months of pregnancy would often withdraw from public life almost entirely. No calling on neighbors, no attending church services in the same visible pew, no walking in the park at the fashionable hour. This wasn't always framed as shame, exactly. Though shame was certainly tangled up in it, it was framed as delicacy, propriety, the idea that a visibly pregnant body simply wasn't a fit sight for public company. Rather the way we might now feel oddly about discussing certain bodily functions at a dinner table. Not forbidden, exactly, just not done. For working-class women, the picture looked entirely different, and there's something worth noticing in that gap. A farm labourer's wife, or a woman working in one of the new industrial mills of Manchester or Leeds, had no real option of withdrawing from public life at 7 months pregnant. She worked because her family needed the wages, right up until labour itself sometimes began. Factory inspectors' reports from the period occasionally noted, almost in passing, women giving birth within hours of finishing a shift at the loom. There was no accouchement corset for her, no elegant withdrawal to a quiet parlour. Pregnancy, for her, was simply something that happened while everything else kept happening too. The same 12-hour days, the same walk to and from the mill gates in the cold. So you have, side by side in the very same decades, two entirely different pregnancies happening under the name of the same word. One hidden behind lace curtains and careful corsetry, treated almost as a private ailment to be managed discreetly, the other carried openly through mill floors and market stalls. because there was no privacy left to retreat into. It's one of those small, quiet ironies history hands you if you look closely enough. The delicacy of pregnancy was, in many ways, a luxury only the comfortable could afford. There's a particular kind of humor in some of the advice literature from this period, if you read it now with a bit of distance. One popular household manual advised expectant mothers to avoid excitement of the mind during pregnancy. No thrilling novels, no upsetting news, nothing that might overstimulate a delicate nervous system. Presumably the author had never met a woman managing 5 children, a coal fire, and a husband's dinner on a single day's income, because that woman's nervous system was getting plenty of excitement regardless of what novels she wasn't allowed to read. Let's slow down here, the way the fire slows down once the coals have settled. Imagine the ordinary texture of an afternoon for Mrs. Ashworth, 6 months along, confined mostly to her own rooms now. There's a soft scratch of her needle through linen as she works on tiny garments for the child to come. This was one of the few pregnancy-related activities considered entirely appropriate, even charming, for a woman to be seen doing. Sewing baby clothes was, in a sense, the one publicly acceptable acknowledgement that a pregnancy existed at all, a discreet, domestic hint rather than a direct statement. Outside, you can hear rain beginning against the window glass, that particular soft patter that seems to slow time down even further. A maid brings in a tray, beef tea, perhaps, or a milk pudding, since diet during pregnancy was taken very seriously, though the advice was often bizarre by modern standards. Some physicians recommended a heavier, richer diet to build up the blood. Others insisted on the opposite, a plain, restricted diet to keep the child small and the labor easier. A strange and rather sad piece of logic when you sit with it, weighing a mother's ease against a child's own start in life. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people, gently, the way a small twist surprises you in a story you thought you already understood. Quickening. The moment a woman first feels her baby move carried enormous emotional and even legal weight in this era, far more than we might assume today. Before quickening, in certain older legal and religious traditions, still lingering into the Victorian period, a pregnancy wasn't always considered fully alive in quite the same sense. The first flutter of movement, usually somewhere around the 4th or 5th month, was the moment the pregnancy became emotionally real to the wider household. The moment a husband might finally be told with certainty, the moment a mother might allow herself to truly believe in the child she was carrying, after so many pregnancies of this era ended before they reached that point. Because that's the quiet grief sitting underneath all of this lace and corsetry and careful withdrawal from society. Miscarriage and stillbirth were extraordinarily common, so common that many women learned not to speak of a pregnancy at all in its early months, guarding it privately, almost superstitiously, until quickening confirmed that this one, at least, seemed to be taking hold. It wasn't coldness. It was a kind of protective silence, built from painful experience repeated across generations of women who had learned, the hard way, not to hope too loudly too soon, still quiet, still hidden, still hers alone to carry in those early months. That was simply how it had to be. But there was one particular moment in every pregnancy, no matter the woman's class or her careful discretion, when all that privacy fell away completely. A moment involving a stranger's hands, a closed door, and a decision about her body that, in the eyes of the law and the church alike, was never entirely hers to make. Here's something that tends to stop people mid-thought when they first hear it. For much of the Victorian era, a woman in the middle of labor, in genuine physical danger, sometimes fighting for her life, could still be expected to keep her body covered from the very man who had been called in to save her. Not partially covered, almost entirely. A physician might spend an hour working to turn a breech child, hands moving beneath layers of sheet and petticoat, and never once actually see what his hands were doing. Welcome back. If you've been drifting in and out, there's no wrong way to listen to this. Let your shoulders drop again. We're going deeper now into that closed bedroom door, into the moment where a stranger's hands entered a woman's most private crisis. and where propriety and survival sat, uneasily, side by side. The man midwife, that was the term used, distinct from the female midwife, who typically handled ordinary births, usually only entered the room when something had already gone wrong. A labor stalled too long, a child positioned badly, bleeding that wouldn't stop. His arrival itself was a kind of alarm bell, and everyone in the room understood it that way. And when he did arrive, the choreography of modesty that followed him through the door was almost its own strange ritual. A sheet, sometimes called a modesty sheet, would be draped over the woman's knees and lower body, pinned or held by an attending woman so that only a small gap remained, just enough for the physician's hands to pass through, guided by touch and by the verbal descriptions of the midwife or mother already in the room. He would kneel or sit low beside the bed, his face turned toward the wall or the middle distance, working almost entirely by feel. The position of the child, the dilation, the presence of the cord, translating what his fingers told him into instructions spoken aloud, without ever meeting the woman's eyes, without ever actually looking at what was happening. Sit with that for a moment, the way you'd sit with something strange in a dream. Imagine being that woman, in pain, frightened, perhaps bleeding, and the person meant to save you is deliberately not looking at you, out of respect for a kind of modesty that in this exact moment seems almost beside the point. And yet, that was precisely the logic of the age. Modesty wasn't suspended for medical necessity. It was, if anything, held even more carefully in the moments of greatest vulnerability, as though decorum were a kind of medicine in itself, something that needed to be protected even while the body was failing. There's a dry, almost absurd humor buried in some of the training manuals written for man midwives. In the earlier decades of the century, the kind of humor that only becomes visible with distance. Some instructors taught their students to practice examinations on models or on cloth-draped mannequins, specifically so they could learn to identify positions and complications by feel alone without ever needing direct sight. Because direct sight of a real patient's body was considered, even in a teaching context, something to be avoided wherever humanly possible. A doctor could spend years training his hands to see what his eyes were forbidden to. As the century wore on, this began to shift, slowly, unevenly, depending on class and region and which physician you happened to get. Hospital-based obstetric training, growing through the middle decades of the century, gradually normalized more direct examination, particularly for poorer women who were treated in charitable lying-in hospitals rather than in their own homes. And here again that same uncomfortable irony returns. It was often the poorest women, without the means to insist on the old proprieties, who first experienced anything resembling modern obstetric examination, not because anyone believed their comfort mattered less, exactly, but because they had less power to enforce the old rules, and less choice about who touched them and how. Let's bring it back to a single room, a single night, so it doesn't stay abstract. Imagine a modest terraced house, 1858, somewhere in the East End. The labor has stretched past its second full day. The midwife, an older woman with decades of experience, has done everything she knows how to do, and the child still hasn't turned. There's real fear in the room now. Quiet fear, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits heavy in the corners like the smoke from a badly drawing chimney. Someone has finally been sent for a doctor, though the family can barely afford the fee. And there's a hushed, worried conversation in the front room about how it will be paid for, conducted in low voices, so the laboring woman won't hear and worry further. The doctor arrives carrying a small leather case of instruments. Forceps, perhaps, an instrument that had existed in various forms since the 17th century, but was still regarded with a mixture of hope and dread. Forceps could save a child and mother when a labor had truly stalled. They could also, in less careful or less experienced hands, cause terrible injury. There was no reliable way, in that low-lit room, for a frightened family to know in advance which kind of outcome they were about to receive. The sheet is arranged. The doctor kneels. His hands move beneath the cloth, careful, patient, translating touch into a quiet, steady stream of instructions to the midwife, and the mother holding the other woman's hand. Outside, rain has started again, tapping softly against a small window, and somewhere down the street a church bell marks the hour, muffled by the weather. None of it changes what's happening in this room. Time, in a moment like this, doesn't care about bells. And here's the thing worth sitting with gently, despite everything working against her. The blindness of medical modesty, the total absence of pain relief beyond perhaps a small dose of laudanum if the family could afford it, the complete lack of understanding of infection. Despite all of it, most of the time, women survived. Most of the time, children survived. The numbers were harder than we would ever accept today, but they were not catastrophic in the way we sometimes imagine when we picture this era purely through its worst stories. Skill built entirely through repetition and touch carried these women and their doctors further than you might expect, given how little true medical knowledge underpinned any of it. But when things did go wrong, and sometimes they did, this same night, in this same imagined room, there was very little anyone could do beyond wait and pray and hold a hand. No blood transfusions existed in any usable form yet, no antibiotics, no understanding of the invisible world of bacteria that would, only a few decades later, transform the safety of childbirth beyond anything this frightened family in the East End could have imagined. They were working, in every sense, in the dark. Sometimes literally, by a single guttering candle, and always figuratively, without the knowledge that would one day make this exact scenario almost unthinkably rare. There's a small, quiet grace note, worth including here, something that softens the weight of all this a little. The way a single warm coal keeps a whole grate glowing long after the flames have died down. Women in this era were not simply passive figures suffering through an indifferent system. The community of women who gathered at every birth, mothers, sisters, neighbors, the local midwife, represented an enormous, largely uncounted reservoir of practical knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, entirely outside of any medical textbook. They knew things about positioning, about herbs that might ease pain a little, about how to turn a child gently with careful pressure, about when to simply wait and when to send for help. It was folk knowledge, unwritten and often dismissed by the formal medical establishment of the day, but it was real knowledge nonetheless. Tested and refined across countless bedrooms just like this one, still frightened, still hopeful, still gathered close around one bed in the candlelight. That, more than anything else, was the true center of Victorian childbirth. However the doctors and the modesty sheets and the official record chose to frame it, still careful, still covered, still working blind by candlelight and touch alone, and yet, somehow, still enough to bring a child safely into the world. More often than history sometimes lets us believe. There's one last piece of this world worth carrying with you before we let the story rest. Not the birth itself, but what came after, in the quiet weeks of confinement we touched on earlier, and the strange, tender rituals that marked a woman's slow, careful return to the ordinary daylight world she'd stepped away from. There's one detail from the very beginning of this story worth returning to now, quietly, the way you might return to a room you left hours ago and find it just as you'd left it. Remember that sealed lying-in room, curtains drawn, fire kept burning even in warm weather, a woman confined for 2 full weeks or more, cut off from ordinary daylight. What we didn't sit with yet is just how strange, and in its own way how tender, the ritual of coming back out of that room actually was. Hi again, one last time tonight. If your eyes are heavy now, that's exactly where we want them. Let this final part settle over you slowly, like the last log added to a fire before you bank it down for the night. Picture the same woman we met at the very start. Let's stay with her a little longer. Let her have a name now, since we've spent this whole story in her world. Let's call her Eleanor. 2 weeks have passed, since that long night by candlelight. The room hasn't changed much. The curtains are still heavier than the rest of the house. The fire still kept a little warmer than truly necessary. But something in Eleanor has shifted quietly, the way a tide shifts without any single dramatic moment marking the change. On the appointed day, she is finally allowed to rise properly, to dress in something other than a nightgown, and to step, for the first time in a fortnight, into daylight that hasn't been filtered through heavy curtains. There's a particular vulnerability to that first true daylight after confinement. Eyes adjusting, legs a little unsteady, the whole ordinary world suddenly feeling slightly too bright, too loud, too fast, after 2 weeks lived entirely within 4 walls and firelight. The churching ceremony we touched on earlier waited for her at the end of this quiet passage, a formal, gentle re-entry into the sight of the community. She would walk to the church, sometimes escorted by her mother, or a close female friend, dressed carefully, modestly, and take part in a short service of thanksgiving specifically written for women who had survived childbirth. The prayer book of the era included exact wording for this moment. A blessing for the woman that cometh to give her thanks after childbirth. An act of gratitude, but also, if you listen closely to the shape of it, an act of quiet acknowledgement that she had come through something genuinely dangerous, something not every woman in her position survived. There's a soft, dry irony worth noticing here too, the kind that doesn't undercut the tenderness of the moment but sits alongside it. In some parishes, women were not permitted back into full church life, not permitted to bake bread for sale, not permitted certain everyday tasks, until this churching had taken place. As though childbirth itself had placed her in a kind of temporary, gentle exile from ordinary life, one that only a formal blessing could fully lift. Eleanor, dressing carefully that morning, doesn't think of it as exile. She thinks of it, mostly, as simply how things are done, the shape her whole life, and her mother's life before her, has always taken after a birth. Walking to church that morning, the streets feel different to her than they did 2 weeks ago, though nothing about them has actually changed. The same baker's cart rattles past. The same washing lines stretch between buildings overhead, damp linen shifting slightly in a mild breeze. But Eleanor notices these ordinary things with a kind of fresh attention, the particular clarity that comes after any long stretch spent indoors, away from the world's simple daily motion. At the church, the vicar reads the appointed words, and Eleanor kneels, briefly, in the same worn wooden pew her mother once knelt in after her own births, and her mother's mother before that. There is something quietly moving in that repetition, if you let yourself feel it, not dramatic, not a grand historical statement, just an ordinary woman taking her small, expected place in a chain of women, stretching back further than anyone in the church that morning could actually trace. Afterward, there might be a small gathering, tea, perhaps a modest cake, neighbors calling briefly to see the child properly for the first time, admiring tiny fingers, murmuring the gentle, half-joking predictions people always make over infants. This one will be tall, this one has her father's chin, this one already looks like trouble. It's a small, warm scene, and it's worth letting yourself sit inside it for a moment, because so much of what we've walked through tonight has been heavy. And this ordinary, quiet gathering was the gentle other half of the story, the part that made all the difficulty worth carrying, because that's really the truest thing to take from this whole hidden world we've moved through tonight. It was hard, in ways modern life rarely asks of us anymore. Painkillers withheld or unavailable, modesty prioritized even over sight in moments of medical crisis, death numbers we would find unacceptable today, quietly folded into the ordinary rhythm of every parish, every street, every family's private history. And yet, threaded all through that hardship, there was also this. Women gathered around other women, hands passing down knowledge no textbook contained, small rituals of thanksgiving and community, marking each safe passage through danger, quiet humor and quiet tenderness, surviving even in rooms sealed off from daylight for 2 full weeks at a time. Eleanor, walking home from church that afternoon, child held carefully against her shoulder, doesn't know any of the numbers we've talked about tonight. She doesn't know the maternal mortality rate for her decade, or the name of the Scottish physician working on chloroform 200 miles to the north, or the debates raging in medical journals about corsetry and confinement. She only knows that she is walking home, in daylight with her child, past the same baker's cart and the same shifting washing lines, and that the curtains in her bedroom will be opened properly again tonight, for the first time in 2 weeks. Still tired, still careful with each step, still quietly amazed at her own daylight. That was simply what it meant, for a woman like Eleanor to have come through it, if you think back now to where we began tonight. That first quiet, startling image of a room a woman wasn't allowed to leave, of hands working blind beneath a sheet. You can see the whole shape of the journey we've taken together. From that sealed, firelit room all the way out to daylight, to a church pew worn smooth by generations of women before her, to an ordinary afternoon, with tea and a sleeping child and neighbors admiring tiny fingers. The room Eleanor couldn't leave, right at the very start of tonight's story, was never really the whole of her world. It was simply one quiet, hidden chapter in it, heavy, yes, but always, eventually, opening back out into daylight. And that, gently, is where we'll leave her, and where we'll leave you too tonight. If this story kept you company for a little while this evening, you're welcome to like or subscribe on your way out, but only if it felt worth it to you. There's no pressure in that, not tonight. Let your eyes stay closed now, if they haven't already. Let the fire in that imagined room burn down slowly, the way fires always do, embers settling into a soft, quiet glow. There's nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to carry tonight.